now coming to the second half. Our chief speaker this afternoon is Professor Jane Barlow from the University of Warwick, who's going to be talking about the early years and the importance of supporting the early years and the influence this has on future outcomes for young people and into adulthood. We'll then be splitting up into groups. We'll remind you where the groups are before we go there, and then we'll be meeting back here for feedback through these excellent cartoons. So we do need to thank two local sponsors. We did write out to local firms, and we got positive response from Tesco, who has given us a voucher. Sorry.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I was a tad worried when I discovered myself in a taxi with the only Welshman who isn't interested in rugby, but I figure things will be all right. Let's see. Okay, so what I want to do in the next 45 minutes or so is take us back in time. I want to take us back really to the very beginning and focus in particular on the first years of life. And I split my paper up into three parts really. I want to start really just by focusing very briefly on a very recent study that's been produced by Professor Harriet Ward at Loughborough University that I think really tells us something that we all know in a sense. It's very good to see it there at the end of a piece of research, but it's where we're at really, and it is practice that needs improving. I then want to go and say something about really why the very early years are important, and I want to focus your minds really on some very recent neurological and attachment-based research, and I also want to focus on what we now know about the very early aspects of parenting and why they are very important for all children across the spectrum. And then I want to conclude just by saying something fairly briefly about what it is we really need to be doing differently. So where are we now? This was Harriet Ward's study. It was a prospective study across 10 local authorities, and they had a sample of 57 children. They managed to follow 43 of these children up until they were 3 years of age. And there were children who were the subject of a core assessment, a Section 47 inquiry, or who became looked after before their first birthdays. And this here you can see, if you go and Google that, brings you up a very nice summary of the research report. And I really just wanted to flag up the key findings for you. So in terms of identification, of course, what did they discover? All the key factors that you would expect to predict a high-risk sample of children were there. High prevalence of things such as drug and alcohol misuse, intimate partner violence, and mental health problems. And one of the key findings at that point was in terms of who made these referrals. You can see down at the bottom, just under 2/3 of these infants were in fact very successfully identified before birth, and almost all before they were 6 months of age. But very few referrals to Children's Social Service for any of these children came from any of these professionals in these groups, which is really very worrying in terms of ambitions to work successfully across disciplines. So what happened in terms of these children? Well, by the time they were 3 years of age, 65%, 2/3 of these children were living with a birth parent, and 1/3 of them had been permanently placed away from home. In terms of the 2/3 of children that were still living with the birth parent, you can see here that 16 of them, 57%, 2/3, were living with a parent who had succeeded in overcoming some of their problems and had been reclassified as being at low risk. However, 1/3 of this sample at 3 years of age was still living with birth parents who'd shown little positive change, and these infants now were classified as at medium high or very severe risk of suffering significant harm. And indeed, I suspect many of them had already experienced it. So by 3 years of age, over half of the children were showing serious developmental problems, things such as poor speech and significant behavioural difficulties. The level of aggression in these children was already very high. Many of them, or some of them, were self-harming. Some of them couldn't be left in nurseries with other children because they harmed other children. and many of the placements were approaching breakdown. So of these children who had been permanently placed away from home, the key message is that the process by which they were removed was so delayed, in fact, that the majority of them were already severely affected by the process of being left in these homes, and many of them were in placements that were breaking down really because their level of problems were so severe that their foster carers were not managing them particularly well. And Harriet talks about the process of double jeopardy, and she talks about the long-term well-being of 60% of these children being affected by this process of double jeopardy. So first of all, we leave these children in these homes for periods that are far too long, up until they're 2, 3, 4 years of age. And then what happens is we remove them, and then we put them through this system, which is a process of repeat removals from one place to another. Which is what she, before we hopefully find them a permanent placement of some sort. She refers to that as double jeopardy. Lots of evidence about repeated assessments being done not very well, particularly many specialist parenting assessments made by psychologists, psychiatrists or independent social workers. These were a major cause of delay. They were done time after time after time with a view to giving parents the best chance really of showing that they could change if there was going to be some change. However, for the majority of these parents, there was very little intervention put in place really between these assessment points to give them the best chance. All of the recommendations were followed. 2/3 advised that children should remain with the birth parents, but in over half of these cases, the children eventually had to be removed. So, the summary really here is parenting assessments frequently repeated within very short time frames, during which parents were actually given very little opportunity to overcome previously identified problems. In terms of intervention, again, a pretty depressing picture, I think. Far too short. Social work interventions were really a very short duration. Half of the child protection plans for babies were for 32 weeks or less, and almost all for less than a year. Families who did manage to change and were apparently getting on well had all their support withdrawn, and the cases were closed prematurely, in Harriet's opinion, and kinship care was very often viewed as being the best alternative option for many of these children, without really very much regard really for the previous history of these kinships, poor parenting, their personal problems, or their knowledge about the child. So I think that really, as I say, just tells us what we know, doesn't it really, which is that, things aren't going particularly well during this period, and I think, the serious case reviews are a very powerful testimony to this. So I just want to spend a little bit of time reminding us really about why this period is so important in terms of children's development, and why it is these children were doing so badly at 2 and 3 years of age, and why it is that we need to be doing things differently. This slide comes from Robin Balbirnie, who is an infant mental health specialist. He said I could have it, and it is a very lovely slide because it shows you really how we get from the sort of trauma in infancy that I'm going to be talking about, which results in this disorganised attachment, through to these longer term problems that we see when children get into adolescence and on into their adult life. And the argument really, and I'm going to be explaining a little bit about why this happens, is that the nervous system and the brain they adapt to this very stressed emotional environment that children who are being abused in the very early years experience. These children, of course, go through life in this very highly aroused and stressed state. They experience these unbearably painful emotional states, and I want to say something about that really, because one of the things that we now know about early parenting and infancy is that is a key time point for children to be learning to manage their emotional states. And if children are being exposed to parenting that's not helping them to do that, it leaves children with ill-equipped really to manage the normal emotional hurdles that children are confronted with. And these are the long-term patterns really. So some children retreat, some engage in these self-destructive actions, and of course predominantly males and increasingly more girls, I think, engage in this acting out and destructive course of pattern. And of course, this is a reinforcing, self-reinforcing strategy. So why does this happen? This happens really, I think, because of the things that I'm showing you here on this slide. These are the key stages of childhood down here, and these are the key developmental domains going across the top. And these are the periods that I'm really going to be talking about today. But in particular, I want to focus on infancy, because this is the period when children should be regulating their emotions or learning to regulate their emotions. Once upon a time, psychologists were fascinated really by children's cognitive development, and actually what we're realising now is that there's something terribly important precedes children's cognitive development, and that's their capacity for affect regulation. And affect regulation refers to children's capacity to manage their emotional states. So the three key domains of development, their emotional and social development, their intellectual development, and their behavioural development. And these are the three sort of key tasks that we need children to be doing, if you like, during infancy. So developing a secure attachment, the capacity for trust, showing signs of alertness and curiosity in their environment, and this that we call impulse control, which is the beginning, the first stage, if you like, of beginning to manage your impulses and your emotions. And these stages really are very much related. So children who have been in the sort of environment during the early years that does not enable them to achieve these developmental tasks or to succeed in doing them are ill-placed really when they get to childhood and adolescence to do some of these things here. So children who haven't been enabled to develop impulse control can't engage in goal-directed behaviour when they get to childhood and show signs of social responsibility. And then, of course, we have to invest a lot of money in supporting older children with the sorts of problems that they present with at that point. But they begin back here, really. And these domains are not discrete domains, so you will see as I go on, actually, that really children's attachment security is one of the things that enables them to begin to take an interest in the world around them, and their attachment security is also the thing that really mediates the way in which their growing capacity to manage their regulations, their emotions is controlled. So that's the overall picture. The key points really in terms of the first 3 years of life are these. First of all, babies are born with very, very immature brains, and much of the neurological development that takes place during the first 2 years of life. And I've got a graph that will show you that in some detail in a moment. I think once upon a time we thought that there was some sort of genetic blueprint for all of this, and what we're realising now is that there is no genetic blueprint, and you will all have come across the term epigenetics, which really describes very beautifully, I think, the way in which our development as individuals is shaped by the environment, and the way in which our genetic disposition is shaped by the environment. And the key aspect of the environment in terms of children's early development is their interaction with their primary caregivers. And this is the key to the story, really, and it's really why the sort of damaging interaction with primary caregivers that children who are exposed to in abusive environments has such a deleterious impact on their entire lives, really. So the other part of the jigsaw really is that the early caregiving environment really influences the child's attachment status. And I just want to remind people about attachment and its significance, because the research on attachment now is really very, very sophisticated. And I see some people wandering about saying, oh, I'm not particularly interested in attachment. Attachment is just so central. The research is really very, very solid and very, very convincing. And we really need to be taking account of it in terms of children's safeguarding and what we do. So the key thing about the attachment relationship is that this mediates, if you like, the impact of the early environment on the child's developing central nervous system. So let me unpack that a little bit, because that all feels a tad heavy for an early afternoon slot where you can feel yourselves drifting into a state of sleep. Nobody's snoring yet. This shows the early brain development, and you can see this over here is shows the neural connections that are just beginning to take place at 1 month. And look, you can see how dense these connections are really getting over this period of time. And the development really is this rapid. And so you will have come across many of you the term use it or lose it. What's happening during this period is this rapid proliferation of all these neural connections, and those that don't get used then actually get pruned away. And so rapid development taking place, mostly as a result of the input from the child's environment. This slide shows you the sensitive periods in the early brain development. So what we've got going up this side here is the level of sensitivity of the brain, with low sensitivity down here and high sensitivity up here. And what we've got here are the preschool years. This line marks off the 5th year of life, and then 6, 7 and onwards from there. And each of these lines corresponds to an aspect of early child development. So you can see this dark blue line corresponds to this habitual ways of responding. You can see that this purple line corresponds to emotional control. And what this slide shows overwhelmingly is that the infant brain is optimized, is most sensitive to developing these neural pathways during this early period of time. And I really don't want, we can see it's downhill after 5 years, isn't it, basically? I really don't want you to take away from this paper the message that you can't do anything after this period, because you absolutely can. The human brain is very, very plastic, and that it has high plasticity, I should say, and that is what enables us to develop and grow. But I mean, if you take language development, you can see how easily children become bilingual, multilingual during these periods in their lives. And if I don't know any of you have tried to learn a new language when you've got in your 20s and 30s, it's bloody hard, isn't it? And it kind of just doesn't work. And that's this brain sensitivity. Okay, so that is the importance really in terms of the developing brain. This is the period for children, the preschool years. And we now know quite a lot about, as I said, the most important aspect of the early environment is the interaction that's going on with primary caregivers. And the research suggests that 3 particular aspects of the early environment are very important. And I've highlighted them here. One is the parents' sensitivity or attunement. And this refers really to the parents' capacity to really move, if you like, to where their baby is at, and to, if you like, scaffold themselves around this developing infant. And I'll show you what that looks like on a video clip when it's going well, and what it looks like when it's not going well. The other thing that's very important is this process of mirroring, and you can actually see there's a very nice piece of mirroring going on here, but you'll also see it in the video clip. And mirroring is very important because that is how infants begin to get a sense of who they are. Our first mirrors are our primary caregivers, and they're the people who mirror back to us what we're feeling. So when a baby is distressed, what you do is a sensitively attuned parent pops their head on one side and looks sympathetically and says, "Oh, darling, you're having a really bad day," and you know, talks to the baby sensitively, and that is that process of mirroring. And we actually call it marked mirroring because we don't mirror back exactly what infants are feeling. Of course, you know, if we've got a squealing infant and you squeal back at it, that would be deeply unhelpful. So we refer to it as marked mirroring. And that really enables the infant to understand that the parent isn't experiencing what they're experiencing, but that they've understood it and is able to reflect it back. And the third area that there is some very nice research emerging into is this term that here, reflective function. Elizabeth Minds calls it mind-mindedness. And this refers to the parent's capacity really to treat their infant as an intentional being and to understand their behaviour in terms of their internal states. And you very often see in parents who are very disadvantaged or abusing parents is they misattribute things to their children. So they will very often look at their baby and say, you're doing that to annoy me. When in fact, you know, the baby isn't capable of doing something to annoy them, and they're not really being able to understand that in terms of the fact that the child's feeling grumpy or fed up or tired, and that internal state is what is causing their behaviour. And that is we call that as a reflective function. And all of these are very, very significant predictors of infant attachment security, which I want to come back to in a minute. But I just want us to look at this in the video in a minute. The most important thing about all of these The most important thing about these three aspects of parenting is that they come together around this concept that we call affect synchrony. Now, affect synchrony, otherwise known as the dance, refers to the way in which attuned caregivers and their babies interact with one another. So what we know is that by about 2 months of age, I put the mother's face, but it should of course be the primary caregiver's face, is the main source of emotional communication to an infant. And what emerges is very highly arousing, affect-laden interactions, face-to-face interactions that expose infants to high levels of cognitive and social information. And in order to regulate that, there is this dance. So what happens is parents are momentarily in this state of synchrony with their infants, then there is a rupture as the baby looks away or the parent looks away, and then sensitively attuned parents are able to repair that rupture. What happens in the sorts of parents that we're thinking about here, parents where there's domestic violence, mental health problems, substance misuse, is that this dance, this affect synchrony either isn't there, so you don't get these moments of attunement, and I'm going to show you that on a video in a moment, or what happens is they spend a lot of time outside of it, so there's lots of ruptures, but there's no ability on the part of the parent to repair these. These are absolutely fundamental to infant development and to attachment security. And infant exposure to very prolonged negative emotional states, either directly in interaction with a parent, whether it's a parent who is being very intrusive or aggressive, or just by virtue of being in an environment that is very frightening. Domestic violence is an example. These are very toxic to infants in terms of their developing brain. This slide just describes very nicely to you that process of synchrony. So attuned mutual coordination between mum and infant occurs when the infant's squeal of delight is matched by mum's excited clapping and sparkling eyes. They're having a really lovely time together. The baby's become overstimulated now. He arches his back and he looks away from mum. A disruption's occurred and there's a miscoordination. The mum's still excited, she's leaning forward, but she's beginning to pick up the cues actually, because this baby's become serious and is now pulling away. So she's picking up this cue, she's beginning the repair. She stops laughing and with a little sigh she quietens down. Baby then has managed to adjust his emotional state and he comes back and makes eye contact with mum again. Mum and baby gently smile at each other, they are back in synchrony, in attunement with one another. That is the process, that is the dance, that is that affect synchrony, rupture, repair. And that is key really to children's development. Let's just have a look at that happening on this video. Oh, we've got a little bit of sound there. So this baby's tuned out at this point, okay? That's a moment of affect synchrony. Mum and baby have found each other. And we call this proto-conversational turn-taking. Okay, and there's like an emotional conversation going on here between this mum and this baby. You see that piece of mirroring there? Mum just automatically mirrored what baby is doing. And what this mum is doing is she's very, very sensitive, she's very attuned, and she is looking for where this baby is at in terms of his emotional state all the time. So she has effectively wrapped herself around this baby and saying, where are you at? And if you could hear the conversation that she's having with him, it's really lovely. So she's saying, I think you're a bit tired today, Tyler. We had a bad night, didn't we? It wasn't a good night. We didn't get much sleep. And it's a real process. And that is that reflective function that I was talking about. So she is treating this little chap as an intentional being. And all of that is terribly, terribly important in terms of the soft wiring of the baby's brain, and it's also terribly, terribly important in terms of this infant's developing sense of who he is as a person. This goes on for quite a while, and it's got a feel-good factor to it, hasn't it? You look at it and you think, this is just lovely, this is this mum and this baby having a lovely time. But all of those three factors that I just talked to you about are there. Mum's attuned, she's very sensitive, there's lots of mirroring going on here for this baby, and there's really good reflective function. That's what it looks like when it's going well. Why is this important? Well, it's important at a brain level, as I just said, because it's helping the connections. What happens is baby looks at mum, sees these great big dilated pupils, which is evidence that her sympathetic nervous system is aroused. It's a bit like being in love. Her nervous system is aroused, his nervous system, then becomes aroused, and his heart rate goes up. When his heart rate goes up, that leads to a very nice biochemical response in his brain. It leads to these pleasure neuropeptides being released, which dopamine's one you'll have come across, released into the brain, and dopamine helps all those connections that I showed you on that first slide to become established. So when you get families doing all these doting, loving looks with their babies, they're doing something terribly, terribly important. And we do it automatically. We do it, it's biologically programmed into us for when we have babies and when we don't have other problems to distract us from it. Negative looks, on the other hand, trigger a very different biochemical response. They trigger the release of cortisol into the baby's brain. And one of the things, babies have circulating cortisol, and they need their parents to help them regulate it. So a parent that's soothing you helps you to bring your cortisol level down. A parent that's scaring you is increasing the levels of cortisol and thereby the impact that it's having on your brain. And at the very benign end of the continuum, we've got depressed mums. We've got this research here. Nearly half of these babies of mums with postnatal depression showed reduced brain activity. It was in the left frontal part of the brain, and that is the part of the brain that enables children as they grow older to express very strong emotions, joy, interest, anger. So these babies are being soft-wired to be very flat, depressed babies. If we go to the other end of the continuum now, and we're talking about babies where there is persistent neglect and trauma, we've got a very different impact on the brain. And I mean, the literature on this is massive now. I've tried to summarise it in 2 slides here, but you've got overdevelopment of the brain stem and the midbrain, and these control for things such as anxiety, impulsivity, affect regulation and hyperactivity. And you also, in these children, you get deficits in cortical functioning, which means they're not very good at problem solving, and it also affects their limbic function. And these children are very poor. You can see it right from 2-year-olds in nurseries. They're not able to empathize with other children in the way in which children who haven't been exposed to this early environment are. And that's the impact on the brain. People seen this slide before? Yeah, it's been about a bit. So that's the normal brain. You can see here very short cortical area across there and very significantly enlarged ventricles. And we talk about this as being a sensitive period, but actually, you know, once a child is 3 or 4 that's got a brain that's been impacted to this degree, you know, we're talking about children having learning problems, significant learning problems, speech problems, you know, that child's going to be struggling with that throughout their life. And this shows the impact. These are PET scans, and these show the parts of the brain that are working when you're exposed to different bits of the environment. So this is the PET scan on this side over here of a normal 3-year-old child. these are the temporal lobes, and these are the parts that respond to sensory input from the environment. And you can see they're all brightly lit up. This is a brain that's functioning really well. This is the scan of a three-year-old orphan from a Romanian orphanage. So very severe sensory deprivation in the early 3 years of their life. And you can see that there are black holes here. I mean, the networks, the connections just have not been established. So this infant's also being exposed to the same things that this infant is, but it's not there, it's not working, okay? So it's going to take a lot of environmental input to enable this child here to do anywhere near as well as this child here. So let's go on. The other reason that those three forms of parenting are important is not only its impact on the developing brain, its impact on the child's attachment security. Bowlby, of course, talked about attachment back in the 60s. It seems like a long time ago now. He talked about the emotional bond between the infant and caregiver. And people, I think, often confuse attachment and bonding. Bonding refers to the mother's relationship to the child. Attachment is the child's attachment security to the parent. So when we're talking about attachment, we're talking about the security of the child in terms of their relationship with the parent. And the key, we've realised, I mean, Bowlby in the 1960s talked about attachment being the biological mechanism that keeps children safe. But what we're actually realising is that attachment is what enables infants to manage the different states of emotional arousal that they're exposed to. That is what that attachment relationship is doing. And I'll explain to you why that is in a minute. And we know that the antecedents of attachment, the things that you need to be in place, are sensitive, emotionally responsive caregiving from a parent who engages in mirroring and who is capable of reflective function. And we know that children who are exposed to these sorts of early environments have something we call insecure attachment. They also have something we call disorganised attachment. So who is securely attached? If you look at a population sample, 2/3, if we looked across us in here today, 2/3 of us would be securely attached. And of course, attachment security goes, we know from the research that your attachment security in childhood goes with you throughout into adult life. So these children had very sensitive caregivers. When they were upset, when they ran to mum or when they ran to dad, mum and dad responded sensitively to them. And these children learned that their caregiver is a secure base for them at times of stress. The parent regulates their excessively high emotional state for them by calming them down, helping them, comforting them. And they also act as a secure base for them to go out and begin to again explore the environment. Those are the two key functions of secure attachment. 2/3 of us, a third of us in this room, will be insecurely attached. Some of us will be what we call anxious resistant. These children, and those of us who are it as adults, have learned that we need to upregulate in order to maintain closeness. So these children were exposed to parenting that was a bit erratic. And you can see these children when they're 2 or 3, they're very demanding, they're in your face, and their perception is that in order to have your attention, they need to stay in your face all the time. And when they are distressed, they are not good at using the caregiver to comfort and to regulate themselves. This group of avoidant children, and many, I think probably many men fit into this group as well, these people down-regulate in times of stress in order to... So these children have learned actually that when I run to mum, mum is not there or she distracts me, but she doesn't respond sensitively and in an attuned way. So these children are managing their stress for themselves rather than having their parent help them to do it. And it's being done at a cost to them in terms of their capacity for emotional regulation, because avoidant children are learning, I need to avoid emotions essentially. I don't go near them. They're, it's better to avoid all of this stuff essentially. Now, these are not disastrous. You can see that, very significant proportion of the population have an insecure attachment. Okay, it might compromise your relationship in the long term, it might make it a bit harder, relationships are a bit harder, etc., etc. It's not a disaster. Disorganised attachment attachment is a bit of a disaster, because all of the research following up children with disorganised attachment shows very, very high levels of psychopathology, things such as personality disorder, you know, a whole range of very significant problems. And these children have been exposed to such chaotic caregiving in their early years of life, and not only chaotic but often frightening caregiving, that they have been unable to establish a regular behavioural strategy. And so 15% of population samples have this disorganised attachment, but 80% of children who are abused have a disorganised attachment. And that is really what plays such a significant role, alongside its impact on their early brain development, in compromising their later development. And this is what happens to these children. So this is the upper limit, if you like, for emotional arousal, and this is the lower limit for emotional arousal. And this yellow line here shows the sort of normal ups and downs of infancy, toddlerhood. You know, you go up, you go down, mum helps you manage these difficult emotions. Where you've got a mum that's not helping you manage them, or that's actively scaring you, what happens is that you alternate between very extreme states, and these are the sorts of extreme emotional fluctuations that you can see in long-term problems such as personality disorder. So you get these children go into this very hyper-aroused state, they're terrified by what's going on, they become aggressive, impulsive, they go immediately into this fight or flight mode, and then if that doesn't resolve the problem, if that doesn't make the parents' behaviour become more predictable, then what happens after that is they dip right down here into hypoarousal, and these children dissociate. And dissociation is the only thing that you can do when you can't get yourself out of a situation that's terrifying you. You have to stay there physically, but you take yourself off, or your mind goes off somewhere. And once you get into those sorts of dissociative patterns of interacting, that is the pathway into dissociative disorders, multiple identity disorder, and that sort of depression, self-harm. Those are the long-term pathways that those children follow. So children who have a disorganised controlling attachment, they've learned that their caregivers are unpredictable, they're rejecting, they learn that these people are the source of comfort, but they're also the source of distress to them. So this is the essence of the disorganisation, really. What do you do? How do you resolve being with a parent who's supposed to be caring for you, making you feel safe, who's actually scaring you? They represent themselves. We get, as a result of our attachment relationships, we develop these internal working models in an unconscious part of our brain, and these children build up internal working models of themselves as unlovable, unworthy, capable of causing others to become angry, violent, and uncaring. So other people are, on the whole, perceived to be frightening, dangerous, and unavailable. These children spend much of their time feeling frightened and angry, and there is, of course, little time for them to engage and to benefit from the learning environment that is available. And these are the longer-term strategies that these children go into. You will have seen them by the time they're 3, 4, or 5. We call them compulsive strategies. There's compulsive compliance at the top. These children are utterly terrified. They're watchful, they're vigilant, they're compliant. Many children go into compulsive caregiving, and many of us who are compulsive caregivers go into helping professions, as the sort that is well represented here today. So what you get with these children, you get role reversal, you get parentification, where they're looking after the parent, and these children deny their own developmental needs, not consciously, but that's what's going on. Some children become coercive, and you get a combination of the two, and then you see these children that are completely out of control. They look completely fearless, completely powerful. These children are in effect terrified, but they're acting it out, and they appear out of control and fearless. This is a very nice description from David Howe's book. He says, Caroline's 18 months old. She lives with a mother who's chronically depressed. Mum describes the household as noxious to the soul. She can't tolerate the idea that her depression is affecting Caroline. She says Caroline is the only one who makes me laugh. It's observed that Caroline silently enacts the role of a clown. She disappears into her room and comes out wearing increasingly more preposterous costumes. Caroline makes her mother laugh, but she herself never laughs. And so you can see there at 18 months, that is a child that has adapted herself completely to meet her parents' emotional needs. And she has the disorganised attachment, and that disorganised attachment will have a very significant impact on her long-term development. So with vulnerable parents, we've talked about why it's important across the population that these children get these three sorts of parenting. With vulnerable parents, what happens is the infant's emotional state triggers very profound discomfort. Well, it does in all of us. That is the aim of it, really. It gets you as a parent to move and to do something. But actually, if you've got unresolved issues yourself, then it triggers those unresolved issues, so you can't take the necessary action. What you're actually doing is needing to manage your own emotional state. So the interaction on those occasions becomes characterised on the one hand by parents who withdraw, they become distancing or neglectful, or on the other hand by parents who are very intrusive, and these parents go on to become the sorts of parents who blame and shame and punish and attack. And very often in the very early days, parents will alternate, or mothers will alternate between these two emotional states. And I just want to show you what that looks like on a video. We refer to these as atypical parenting behaviours. This term came from America. It's called FR behaviour, and it refers to parents who are, interestingly, both frightened and frightening. Frightening, they're threatening, they're looming, they're sometimes dissociative, so they, 1 minute they're engaged with the child and then they're miles away. There's lots of disruptions, failure to repair, and this very nice systematic review that showed very significant association between these sorts of FR behaviours, or atypical parenting behaviours, and disorganised attachment in the long term. And this is what it looks like in reality. This is a teenage mum, and we actually don't need, she's a teenage mum who grew up in care, and like the first mum, we asked her to interact with her baby as she would ordinarily. And this is what she did essentially. And she's trying her best here with this baby. She's really trying very hard to interact. But you can see that in terms of those three early aspects of caregiving, look how avoidant this baby is. This baby cannot look at this mum's face. At no point does this baby look at this mum's face. There is no sense of affect synchrony going on here. There's no attunement, there's no sensitivity, there's no mirroring going on, and there's no reflective function on the part of this parent. Because if you imagine what it must feel like to be this little baby, you must feel like a little object, essentially. And if this baby, when we coded this video using the care index, what we found was that this baby is compulsively compliant, and that means that he is, he's already very frightened. He looks very passive on here. Ordinarily, a child would get a bit grumpy about being, moved around in this way, but. And you can see the dissonance between where this baby is at. This baby is rather sad, but mum's face when she looks up is very smiling. We're having a nice time here. Or, actually we're not having a nice time here, but there's no sense of where this baby is really at. And this is disastrous for this child's development. Absolutely disastrous. And when I show this film often to health visitors, they will say to me, I've got a significant proportion of parents on my caseload who I see this sort of interaction with. Okay, and the health visitor of this baby was very good. She tried to get this baby referred to CAMS, and CAMS said, come back when there's a problem. And then eventually, when he was 4, this child got put on the child protection register. But, we can look at this video now, at 1, and see that this is so seriously compromised that this child's development, this child will have a disorganised attachment and will go on to have a range of long-term mental health problems. And we can see that at 1, really. And, we really need to get much better across all of the professional groups, I think, health visitors, midwives, social workers, at getting in there much earlier. So my key message, and that's where I'm coming to at the end, is really we need to be getting it right first time, right from the start. That's an interesting spelling of antenatal there. That's the Welsh version. I live dangerously, don't I? We need to be identifying these factors families antenatally, and I'm working with various places, Oxfordshire most notably at the moment, and we're putting in place there a care pathway that begins at 18 weeks antenatal. So we're getting the pre-birth assessment of mums who are 18 weeks referred to the social work. At that point, we begin an intervention, and I'll tell you in a minute about the different sorts of interventions that are available. The care pathway then goes on, so that, I mean, that's not what typically happens, is it? What typically happens is they get picked up fairly late. By about 35 weeks, we're beginning to decide we need a care plan in place. You know, then the baby's born, and you know, it's downhill from thereafter, basically. This is a proactive strategy, identification at 8 weeks of mothers who have got the sorts of factors that we're talking about. It's not rocket science here, but you know, the midwives are very, very good. They'll tell you where the mental health problems are, the domestic violence, the substance misuse. We know for the better part who these families are. It's what we do after that, really. So we need to be intervening with these families antenatally. At birth, we need to be doing an assessment of the parent-infant interaction, because you can see very early on parent-infant interaction that's compromised and right down at the bottom of that scale in terms of that, like that second one was. Again, more time-limited evidence-based intervention with clear goals that are to be achieved, and then reassessment when the infant's 6 months. And this is with a view really to getting these infants removed by the time they are 8 months, removed where there is insufficient evidence that the necessary improvement has been obtained in order to produce successful outcomes. And concurrent foster care really is a significant part of that, because you know, we can get all of this pathway, you know, we can do it very well, but then often it's that double jeopardy thing. We traumatise the children because we take them out of this damaging family, and then we start moving them across foster placements. You know, at the very time children are developing their secure attachment to their primary caregiver. It starts kicking in at 7 and 8 months, and when you remove a child at that point, then you traumatise them. Okay, so that is effectively something that we've really got to get much better at not doing. So we've got to get much better at doing assessments, and I think the answer is the sort of thing, again, that they've got going on in Oxfordshire, the Family Assessment and Safeguarding Service. This is a specialist, multidisciplinary service. It's provided by Oxfordshire NHS Foundation Trust. There are ones dotted across the country, and it provides an integrated and individually tailored assessment programme to assess the sort of parenting that's going on and the early parent-infant interaction. And I think this has to be much better than the process that we're doing at the moment, which is very erratic and ad hoc. Is home the best place to be? We function, Harriet's study showed that we function with the mindset that says, you know, we've got to keep these children with their families, and we're failing where we don't do so. We're failing when we leave children with families who cannot care for them. That's when we're failing these children. And what we do very often is remove these children from these homes, and then we work our little butts off to get them back into these homes, but we don't do it having achieved much change very often. And pretty well all of this research shows that these children who get moved out of the home and then moved back into the home have much poorer outcomes on the whole than children who remain in the home. This is just evidence from one longitudinal study of reunified words use, which showed you know, significant levels of internalising and externalising problems. Does foster care improve outcomes? Well, the perception, I think, very often is that it doesn't. I think the research evidence is showing quite strongly that it does, particularly where you've got things such as treatment foster care, where you get this enhanced, better trained caseworkers, greater access to services and support for youth and foster families. You get much better outcomes. I've talked about concurrent planning. This is really a form of fostering adoption that works up till children are 6 years old, but for parents with very severe difficulties, it is anticipating that maybe this family, this child's going to need to stay in this foster placement, and that means we don't need to keep moving these children across the different foster placements. And these are just some of the evidence-based interventions. There's lovely evidence now, and this is really quite new, and I say to practitioners it's really very important that you use we need to get some of these methods of training into core practitioner training programs. Health visitor, social workers should all have training in some of these methods of working. But we also need practitioners to use their continuing professional development to go and get themselves trained. Video interaction guidance. If any of you come across a training on video interaction guidance, absolutely fantastic. You know, get out there and do it. We've got things like the Family Nurse Partnership Programme. Parent-infant psychotherapy makes a big difference. The Family Drug and Alcohol course. There's limited evidence, but again, this is a very proactive model that seems to be making a difference. And then there's quite a few parenting programs. And the one that we're using in Oxford, or I'm trialling it with the NSPCC, is the Parents Under Pressure Programme. We call it PUP. It's an ecological model of working with families, and really what we mean by ecological is that it targets lots of domains of family functioning. So the parents' psychological functioning, their social relationships, their parent-child relationships, the social contextual factors. And it's very nice because it's got a lot of mindfulness skills for parents. And that is very important because one of the things these parents can't do is manage their own emotions, and they're using drugs and alcohol and domestic violence as a means of doing that. And once you're taking those things away, then you need to help these parents to manage their emotions in other more positive ways. And these mindfulness skills seem to be particularly good with substance misusing parents. This is an intensive, manualised, home-based intervention. Very easy to get practitioners trained in it. It's delivered in the home over 10 to 12 weeks, but you can continue it as long as you want to, essentially, each session lasting between 1 or 2 hours. And it's goal-focused. It sets very clear goals with each family in terms of the sorts of things that they need to be achieving. Very nice RCT evidence with children of 2 to 8 years, and in terms of these sorts of longer term outcomes. And we are currently working with the MSPCC to do a randomised control trial looking at it with 0 to 2-year-old children of substance misusing parents. So the key messages are really on this slide. 3 years of life, first 3 years are fundamental, they're foundational in terms of everything else that follows. There's considerable scope for prevention of serious problems if and only if we work to the developmental timelines of the child and not the needs of the parents. We've really got to prioritise these children's developmental needs. And I think there are lots of innovative models of working. I want to finish on a positive note because I think there really are some good ways of working coming on board. And you know, as a practitioner, it's up to you really to go and grab some of these new ways and get yourself skilled up, because that is how we will. They are new, and you couldn't be expected to have them at this point in time, but we will get there if you grab them. And these are just some of the publications that some of that evidence is summarised in, if any of you want it. I don't know whether you've got the slides, have you, in a pack? Have people got the slides? Because you're welcome to have them in. You'll put them on the website. And that's it. From over, I think.
Wel, cymuned gwych, ar awr sydd yn iawn. Mi gymryd ni amser i ofyn chydig bach gwestiynau. Os ydych chi'n gofyn yn Gymraeg, mi rydyn ni'r ddau na ni'n trefydeithio. Dwi'n croeso chi ofyn cwestiwn yn Gymraeg. On your behalf, as a group of compulsive caregivers, that was a wonderful presentation. Thanks very much. We've got a broad range of people working in a broad range of practices here. I don't think anybody working wouldn't have been helped in understanding the day-to-day experience and putting in a better framework. You then went on to really throw in some tests and challenges. So because of that, I think we'd like people to interact a bit more with what you were saying. We've got a very short time for questions. I know it's a bit of a large room to stand up and ask questions, but we really would like a few minutes to open up some of the challenges that Jane Barlow has given to us. So anybody wants to respond or ask for any further question or any views?
Development delay after around 3 years, so might have been the case where or you get speech delay and things at that age. It's very difficult to actually use that to prove that maybe there's more going on within a home environment, and it's been put down to you expect that at that particular age. So how do you use that in another way to prove that there is something going on within our environment?
I mean, I think the speech and language development needs to be taken within the broader context of the child's overall development. It's kind of hard to comment on that particular case, but I mean, it's interesting. I sometimes think speech and language development seems to be the area where children's centres are quite good, actually. So we seem to be quite proactive. We can get in there with speech and language stuff, and I think we're not so good on dealing with the broader problems that child will inevitably be addressing if he has been in that particular environment. I absolutely hear your question, and it's really just getting this evidence out there in a sense, isn't it? It's really just helping people to recognise that children who are exposed to those sorts of early environments will have problems, and it's our role to to get them out of those environments, or to change that environment, or to put in appropriate level services to help them address the problems, really. And I don't know whether that helps in any way at all, really, but I think people who don't accept that really are just flying in the face of a very strong body of evidence, really.
Given or accepting the resource implications for a lot of the work, that everything we're talking about today, is there any, or have you had the opportunity to deliver this kind of information to family court judges?
Yes.
Because often asking to remove an 8-month-old child is sometimes challenged not by a practitioner or an expert, only an expert in law.
Yes.
And I wonder...
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's one of the key things that's come out of Harriet's report. She said, one of the major delays is the courts, the solicitors, the whole system that's built up around these early problems. And yes, we absolutely need to reach this audience with this, and it's just beginning to happen, is all I can say, really. But it's two sides of the coin, really. We need professionals who can go into the court and say, we've got the language to say, look, this child is compulsively compliant. That's that side of it. And then we need courts, we need judges who are able to also to understand the importance of this early period.
Yeah, because very simplistically, I have got personal experience of social workers and social service departments going to a court, and the judge deciding you give this parent another 7 months, another 8 months, another year, and yet the professionals involved feel this is not going to improve. We need to act now.
Yeah, I think it will be easier for. I still come back to what I'm saying, which I think is there's two sides of this. We absolutely need judges to revise their thinking and to understand this evidence. But I think we also need, as practitioners, to be able to go in with confidence and say, we've implemented an evidence-based intervention, we've had these goals, we've done this assessment, and this is the impact on this child's development, and then that is the whole. And when that comes together, then we're really in a I absolutely hear what you say. The family drug and alcohol courts were a beautiful example of that working really well, because the judges were all on board. They were primed. They were part of the model, and that's where we need to get to.
Jane, can I just echo that, because it's the strength of professional opinion, isn't it? If they don't get the strength of professional opinion with a good evidence base, then they won't respond. Particularly in cases in which they don't perceive any culpability. So you can have a parent who's struggling to do it but just can't. And it's not like dealing with fractured limbs, which they find difficult enough to do with their own. So it doesn't need to be accompanied by a really solid, strong professional opinion that if you don't do this, then this will be problematic.
Yes. And the introduction of the evidence-based ways of working will really enhance our ability to get there, is what I'm saying. And I think that's the other side of the equation.
Serena, last one. Okay.
Thanks very much again.
You're very welcome.
I know we've got the mapping group, we've